Gina, if you would. Thanks and welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming this evening to this UC Davis Humanities event. I'm Jaimey Fisher. I'm a professor in German and Cinema and Digital Media at UC Davis and the director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute. Tonight's event, which we're offering online, as you can see, and we'll later then upload to our YouTube channel, is part of our book chat series, in which we always foreground the kind of latest scholarship by faculty around UC Davis. The UC Davis Humanities Institute is kind of the leading advocate for humanities and arts on campus. Since the pandemic hit, we've switched our programming to online offerings. We've had a number of programs on the pandemic that are on our YouTube channel, but we were happy to go ahead with Professor Downs' book chat because we thought it was also important to be offering content that doesn't directly bear on the pandemic, to sort of continue to showcase the good work of our faculty at UC Davis. A word about our format this evening. Obviously, we're on Zoom. It's going to be recorded, but it will follow more or less the usual book chat format, which will be that Professor Downs, after I introduce him, will give a short reading from his book to give you a sense of his excellent writing in that book. And then I will ask questions for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will open it up to the floor for a total program of about an hour, or slightly longer, depending on all of our energy levels. As I said, we're really delighted that Professor Downs could join us this evening to talk about his book. Here it is. Hopefully I can see it. The Second American Revolution, Civil War Era Struggle Over Cuba and the Rebirth of the American Republic. It's fading into my background. Published by University of North Carolina Press. So Professor Downs is a professor of history at the University of California, Davis, and the author of 3 books of history. This one, Second American Revolution, as well as After Appomattox. As a German professor, I don't say that. Military Occupation and the Ends of War, and Declarations of Dependence and the Long Reconstruction of Popular Politics in the South, and one prize-winning short story collection, Spit Baths. With Kate Masser, he's also co-edited The World the Civil War Made, co-wrote the National Park Service National Historic Landmark Study of Reconstruction, helped edit the NPS's, that's National Park Service's, first ever handbook on Reconstruction, and lobbied Congress and bureaucrats for support for the first ever National Park Service site dedicated to Reconstruction, proclaimed by President Obama in January 2017. They now co-edit the Journal of the Civil War Era. And so our format, as I mentioned, will be that he'll offer a short reading now, and then I'll ask a few questions about the book before you all have a chance to participate. We're happy to have you ask questions via voice and camera if you're willing to do that. So Greg, do you want to take it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jaimey, and to everyone at the Humanities Institute and at Davis for keeping this going. And thank you to all of you out there in the ether who are signed in. So I'm excited to do it. I'm going to begin with a short reading from the very beginning of the book. Our confusion about the central event in U.S. history begins with the name, the Civil War. What can be confined within the words civil and war is only a fraction of what transpired. The Civil War was not merely civil, meaning national, and not solely a war, at least in the narrow sense that we sometimes use the word. While extraordinary military campaigns raged across the eastern third of the country and smaller ones elsewhere, the struggle could not be restricted to battlefields or resolved by surrenders. The most famous battles were matched by dramatic, violent, and permanent transformations of the United States economy, political order, and constitution. So the war did not simply resolve contradictions in the nation's political order. The war created a new political order through military enacted revisions of the nation's founding document, the Constitution. And the war was thus not solely a war. When historians emphasize battlefields over the internal transformations that the war brought, we domesticate the Civil War, turn it into a brother's war, a restorative, even conservative war for union. In the process, we make the Civil War something less meaningful and unsettling than it actually was. And in the process, we allow the myth of the Civil War to confuse our sense of how the Constitution actually functions, how our political system came to be, how we might fix it. And the conflict was not merely civil, meaning national. The war was instead part of an international crisis. The Civil War not only spilled across borders and affected other countries, as many wars do, but it was fought in part over competing visions of the world's future. Would the world be shaped by free labor republics or by some combination of slavery and monarchy? In response to the war, Great Britain, France, Spain, Mexico, and other Atlantic nations recreated their alliances, their expectations, and in some cases, their future. If it was not a world war, it was a war in part, nevertheless, about the future of the world, or at least the future of the North Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. When we miss these aspects, when we domesticate the Civil War, we construct a politics narrower than its participants' imaginations and experiences. We lose sight of their own international vision, their own habit of looking beyond the nation's borders to understand their own nation's politics. When people in the 19th century referred to what we call the Civil War, they often did so by names that are unfamiliar to us. Although the appellation Civil War seems neutral, even inevitable, the Civil War only emerged as the default reference in the early 20th century, 50 years after the war, and as part of a broader effort to depoliticize the conflict and speed reunion with white Southerners. 20th century vocabularies, cultural needs, and implicit comparisons hang like fog over the Civil War, making it hard to see the landscape clearly. But before the 20th century, many Americans called the conflict the Rebellion, or the War of '61, or the War of Secession, or the Insurrection, and some even called it the Second American Revolution. From there, this is the introduction of the book, and from there I go on to outline the book's main goals, which are to explore the idea of what it means to think about the United States as shaped by a revolution in the mid-19th century, a revolution that changed its place in the world and also changed its constitution and basic structure, and why it is that we've lost that sense of the revolutionary nature of the Civil War and instead have turned it into something less international, less ambitious, less transgressive, in some ways less dangerous. So I'll stop here to avoid the professor's habit of talking on and turn back to Jaimey for some questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that nicely captures also the wonderful writing in the book. I mean, stylistically, I think it's a real achievement too. So congratulations,
Thank you.
Greg. I really enjoyed reading it, and I guess we should not bury the lead. I mean, you raised that in the passage here. I mean, why exactly do you think of the Civil War as a revolution? Why do you argue that? And why have we gotten it wrong all these years?
Yeah. I mean, those are important questions. The first thing I want to say is that a number of historians, including the very greatest historians of the 19th century, have called it a revolution. But what's interesting is that even though this list includes W.B. Du Bois, Eric Foner, Jim McPherson, Steve Hahn, Julie Saville, a number of many others, this has had very little impact not only on the public, but even upon scholars of revolution in other fields. And I think there's some interesting reasons why that we've struggled to understand the revolutionary nature of the Civil War. The one is, as I gestured to there, that there's something very precious to Americans about the idea of it as a brothers' conflict. Some pieces of this arise in an effort to try and recreate a sense of a national unity, but also to create a sense that the United States was almost perfect at its beginning, and it just needed those contradictions fixed, resolved in a civil war. It didn't need a second revolution. This promises to us that the Constitution worked, that the United States is fundamentally stable, that its system that was set up at its founding functioned, and that what we need to worry about is not it falling apart, but how we make sure that we tinker with it in order to keep working. What's striking when you look at the time period is how many people in the middle of the 19th century had lost that sense, that the Constitution worked, that the United States functioned. And how many people talked, as I talk about this book, about the idea that we would divide US history like they divide French history, a first republic that ended, a first constitution that failed, of constitutional founders with interesting ideas, but ideas that weren't sustainable. If a constitution functioned so well, why did it lead to collapse and mass conflict so quickly within one lifetime? And they raised that in order to explain something that they took for granted, but that we've lost. the necessity in a Republican or Democratic order for people to be imaginative participants in making their government and their system and their world, not merely recipients, not to have faith in a magic clockwork, clockworkers of the founders to create something that worked, but instead the necessity for serious, difficult, transformative intervention in order to save the nation. And that in a wide number of ways, different Republicans and some Democrats really wrestled with this question over the period. And my argument in the book is that as we've lost the language of what the Civil War was, we've also lost some of that imagination. That even allegedly bold and radical or transformative ideas about how to remake the country would look not only would look mild compared to the Civil War, but even look mild compared to forgettable late 19th century politicians like Benjamin Harrison. Our sense that the constitutional amendments are unlikely or not worth pursuing, or that other fixes of the political order would seem strange to a wide range even of seemingly moderate people in that era. So I think we've lost that sense of the revolutionary nature of the Civil War, in part because we've convinced ourselves that the country can run on its own and function with as something that's more like a mild tinkering or a restorative effort to fix its paradoxes.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, in your answer, I think you hear what I think is really one of the fascinating contentions of the book is that the war, fundamentally changed the Constitution, or even, did away with it and created a new Constitution in some ways. It remade it so thoroughly, so fundamentally, that it really took a different tack altogether. And you coined this phrase, bloody constitutionalism. I think that's your phrase, which I find both provocative and interesting. I was wondering if you could discuss that and how the Constitution was changed in the Civil War.
Yeah, there's an active debate at the time, and I do try and capture that, about how transformative this new constitutional order would be. And of course, there are people who do argue that it is, that what happens is some kind of more mild or amendment process. But a number of people, as they go through the steps that I lay out of how to transform the Constitution, do say this is a second Constitution. It's a new moment. It's greater than the Constitution. We're not simply aiming to fix it. We're aiming to do something bolder and more transformative than that. And the paths they use to do that, as I describe, are extremely bold to the point that they should make us uncomfortable, of martial law and occupation and so on. This captures what I mean by their sense of bloody constitutionalism. I argue that the middle of the 19th century, participants in the Civil War were highly aware, many of them, both that the United States needed to be revolutionized, but also that any revolution had grave dangers, not only of going too far, which we talk about a lot in US history, but of something that they saw as a concomitant problem, which is going so far that the revolution itself failed. In other words, that the key problem of the French Revolution or of the revolutions of 1848 was not just that they went too far, but that they failed. And they failed because they didn't think about how to preserve themselves. And so mid-19th century Republicans became highly attuned to the idea of how do we transform the order and then exit, so that we can do so through, that we can use these bold tactics to remake the country, but then exit in a way that preserves those gains. And that's what I call bloody constitutionalism, that they use transgressive methods like occupation, martial law, use of Congresses with very small numbers, remaking the Supreme Court when they want to. But they also create this language, even as they are acknowledging that these bold changes, they create a language that says it's just a fix. In that sense, we use this mild language because they taught us to. And they taught us to in order, in part, to cover up their tracks, to make it seem like something that could not be undone, something that was essential to the fabric of the United States. Mm-hmm. You can see some of this in the aftermath of the 1960s, quite a different constitutional moment, maybe or maybe not a revolution. But of the quick effort, and in many ways it seemed, at least for a while, to be a very successful effort to portray those constitutional transformations of the 1950s and 60s as part of an American way, to make segregation and Jim Crow an odd exception. And therefore, in the shock of people today to see some of those safeguards be transgressed or pulled apart, to realize, as people in the mid-19th century did, how thin some of those safeguards actually were.
Yeah, I mean, this drawing away from the revolution that one creates reminds me of the very provocative afterword to the book, actually, not to offer any spoilers, because you return to the notion of revolution at that point, and you take up Eric Foner's notion of an unfinished revolution, and you say very directly this was a kind of finished revolution, actually. So, and taking issue with some of the secondary scholarship, even someone who mentions it as a revolution. So I was
Yeah,
wondering what exactly are the stakes of calling it a finished revolution? And
yeah,
how do you see it then changing what came before it in the scholarship?
yeah. So Eric Foner, dean of 19th century historians, a truly great historian, wrote a landmark history of Reconstruction called Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution. And it's hard to think of a book of history that's had a bigger impact on me or on many other people, or it along with W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which Eric drew upon, you know, and with lots of acknowledgement. And yet Eric's argument about an unfinished revolution, while it's been extremely influential, I think does some work that we should be skeptical of. One of the things it does is it ties, in a way scholars have often done, the work of Reconstruction to its alleged fulfillment in the 1960s. And this, I think, tells a reassuring story that yes, Reconstruction's overthrown. Yes, the constitutional safeguards don't actually have an effect, but it's because it's fulfilled 80 to 90 years later, that its promise remains in place. And this, I think, feeds into this kind of fable of an America that fixes itself and regulates itself. And what I'm interested in in defining a finished revolution are a couple of things, one of which is the of questioning that idea, of thinking about the 1950s, 1960s as needing a bolder, more transgressive approach to constitutionalism than we can quite admit. But also of thinking about the project as defined by the mid-19th century Republicans as in turn complete and finished, that we have to evaluate on its own terms, not for, you know, not purely in hopes that it's fulfilled in a later moment. And why does this matter? I think it matters because it helps to make the US moment comparable with other nations. As I say, they constructed their sense of what a revolution was and how the US should be shaped in close engagement with what's going on in Mexico and Cuba and Spain and Great Britain and so on. But an unfinished revolution makes the US Civil War and Reconstruction something really without comparison. You know, it makes it a category in and of itself. By the ways, and in some ways it does so by making the category of revolution lose a lot of its interpretive value. What revolution by these lights isn't unfinished? And I think it's part of the reason why, even though as scholars we keep talking about the period as a revolution, most social scientists absolutely pay no attention to that and don't treat it as a revolution, in part because we're not talking about it in the kind of ways that they use to talk about revolutions. My own somewhat smartass, view is that, as I say in classes frequently, the United States had one revolution and one civil war, and it's not my fault that we get the names wrong.
Of course, I mean, this is all, I think, very fascinating, but this is only really part of the book, sort of the first chapter. And the latter two chapters, you turn to kind of international questions, which is another major thrust of the work. And I thought, we're a research institute, and so we, which is concerned with kind of generating and incubating research projects. So we often ask people, how they define their archives. And I think your archives are highly indicative of the international direction of the book. So I wonder if you could say a few words about the archives you used,
Yeah.
and then also how that reflects the overall kind of approach methodology of at least the last two chapters.
So one of the things that, as you say, that two of the chapters are really rooted in putting the US Civil War in a context of Cuba and Spain, especially, and to a lesser degree, Mexico and Great Britain. And this came from a couple of sources. One of them was a sense that US Civil War historians are pretty complacent in taking the centrality of their conflict and the meaning of their conflict for granted. It's so important in American popular culture that we kind of don't have to explain or defend it. And that seems like a great thing until we realize the bad mental habits that it promotes and the ways that that kind of complacency goes into our writing and our thinking. I had been interested from an article that I wrote now almost 10 years ago on the ways that Americans themselves were actually much more international and comparativist as they interrogated the period. I wrote an article about the ways that Americans talked about comparisons with Mexico in the 1860s, 1870s that are much more open-ended and vulnerable than we might imagine, in which they look to revolution and civil war in Mexico and the toppling of presidents to explain why they think it's possible that this could happen in the US, not to explain fundamentally differences between the two. And so I knew from that that there was something to say about that international vision, but I also knew that I didn't want to write a book that was just about how Americans understood the world. I wanted to be, more of what we might say as a two-footed or a multi-footed approach. And to really be asking the opposite question, not just how did the US in some ways help make the world or draw upon the world, but in what ways did the world make the US? How might we think about it, as I say, one of the chapter titles is a civil war that the world made. And that led me first to Mexico, which remains a site of interest to myself and to a number of scholars, but even more so to Cuba. And I got interested not just in the idea that scholars have long explored of the relationship between when the US Civil War ends, the end of slavery in the US leaves Cuba and Brazil as the only other major places in the Atlantic world with legal chattel slavery. And the end of slavery in Cuba and Brazil is in some way hard to pin down, related to, if not totally created by, the end of the Civil War in the United States. But what I got more interested in was the question of how did Cuba and Cubans help to break open US politics in the coming of the Civil War. I went and as I did research in Cuba, I would look for documents, which itself was an amazing experience. I found a couple of things. One of which is how interested Cubans were very early on in the idea that US conflict was going to change Cuba, and that it was in some way good or bad in ways they might be able to manipulate or might not. Different Cubans were fascinated by it and highly aware of it. Second, that they saw it as much more radical than you would get from American historiography, that they believed that Northern Republicans truly were a group that intended to exterminate slavery in the world, and that Spain and Cuba, Spanish Empire is still ruling over Cuba at this point, had to respond to that. But third of all, the sort of ways that you could start to see people, the moments when Cubans start to sneak into US literature in very different ways once you see them in their own context. One narrow thing that I'll talk about is that in US context, we do sometimes talk about Cuba as a place that American slaveholders wanted to acquire, to expand in, and to claim slavery, and what's called the filibusters. William Walker, who leads efforts to invade Nicaragua, which had some hoped would spill over into Cuba, and especially Narciso Lopez, a Spanish imperial official who comes to the US and raises soldiers to invade Cuba. From the US portrayal, because these failed, in the US portrayal, he's almost always portrayed by US historians as kind of a fool. That when he gets to the US, he fails. Therefore, it shows that the goal of creating creating a rebellion or an insurrection in Cuba was a big American fantasy. When I got there, I asked to the Cuban archives, after getting through their period of observation and passing their test to request documents, I asked to see the Narciso Lopez file. And they started clearing off excess space. And they brought out folder after bound document, thousands of pages, in which you saw that Spanish imperial officials saw him in exactly the opposite way, as somebody with mass support in Cuba, who had been betrayed by the US in certain odd ways, an echo of the Bay of Pigs narrative, betrayed by the US, which failed to support him, but is really representing a mass uprising, especially of intellectual young Cubans, who they then in turn started to expel in mass numbers, and who arriving in New Orleans and New York especially, these exiled Cubans immediately got involved in US politics to try and turn it toward overthrowing slavery in Cuba. And that became for me a touchstone of the idea that the goal in reading in other archives was not to supplement, but to really ask if our basic narrative frames and our basic operating questions would look the same from elsewhere. To lesser degrees, I found similar things when I went to Madrid in the Spanish Imperial Archives, or to London or Mexico City. I'm still basically fundamentally a US historian. But among that group of US historians who are reminding scholars of the need to put the US in context, not just for its impact upon the world, but for the ways that it shows in the 19th century as a place very vulnerable to being changed by the world too, as it remains today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a fascinating part of the book, the way that some of the kind of touchstones of Civil War history, like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, say, or Missouri Compromise, you were able to tease out a kind of subtext related to Cuba, which I think is not something we learn in school. So it's not only about what's happening in Cuba, but also very much about the way American politicians are reflecting on what's happening in Cuba and thinking about the fate of slavery there.
That's right. We have a very pleasing and effective way of narrating what happened between, say 1845 and 1861, the coming of the Civil War. And I give lectures and I use those, sort of iconic moments myself about how to think about the Wilmot Proviso, the US-Mexico War, the Wilmot Proviso, Compromise 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and so on as these stepping stones towards Civil War. And what's interesting to me are two things. One, when you start to look from an international perspective, how many of those, especially the Kansas Act, were really framed by US actors in international context. The great critique the Republicans had of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was not that it was going to move slavery in mass levels into Kansas, but that it was all a pretense to annex Cuba. And that doesn't make sense in the way that we normally tell the story, but it actually makes perfect sense once we see the world in which the US actors are operating. And the second is it points us to some slightly different moments to break up the sense of the inevitable pull, say from 1845 on, and to really focus upon some moments in the 1850s, early 1850s, between the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where you really do start to see an effort first to bring the country back together after the US-Mexico War, that in some surprising ways seems to be somewhat effective over 1850, 1851, and then to fall apart between 1851 and 1854. And Cuba's not the only reason it falls apart, but it's a major reason that you see this dissolution of an effort to recreate a political center.
Yeah, and so Cuba's a key part of the book, but I thought it was also interesting and surprising and fascinating the way that Spain does loom large. You mentioned Spain briefly, but actually quite a bit of, I think, the final chapter is about Spain and Spanish politics and some of the fallout of what we call the Civil War in Europe for reformists in Spain. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that. Maybe this will be my last question before we open it up. I have some others, but we'll open it up to people if they have questions.
Yeah, while the Cuban story is certainly very, and its relationship to the Civil War is certainly very well known, both among Cuban scholars, of which there's been an incredible explosion of work on, and known, if in some ways in distorted ways, by US scholars. The relationship of the Civil War to Spain is something that's easily lost, in part because US interest in Spain tends to ebb between, between the early 1800s and then restore again with the Spanish-American War. We kind of lose sight of a mid-19th century Spain, as well as because of the failure of the efforts there after the US Civil War. But in fact, Spanish Republicans and abolitionists in Spain are closely watching the Civil War and trying to imagine their way of making use of it. And one of the interesting pieces that comes out of it is actually led by a history professor named Emilio Castelar, who's a Republican and abolitionist in Spain, who's been exiled and in other ways, punished for supporting a republic against the monarchical system in Spain. He sees the Civil War as opening a space for Spanish Republicans and abolitionists to force change, and helps to lead an alliance of Republicans in a generals-led coup in 1868 that topples the monarch. The generals intend to install a constitutional monarchy, and that works for a little while, but Castelar and other Republicans work carefully with the US minister to undermine that monarchy, and then eventually proclaim a first Spanish Republic. And in the most heightened moments where we start to see how the boldness of the Civil War really unleashed an idea of a revolutionary possibility in the world, in the boldest of these moments, Spanish Republicans and the US minister and certain US politicians start to articulate a vision of a United States of Spain, in which Spain will end slavery in Cuba and then make it a state in a new conglomeration. And that state will be allied in a transatlantic alliance with the US and Mexico in a way that's deliberately meant to sideline Britain and to make it a sort of moderate to conservative monarchical force. And this vision, not necessarily of a socialist revolution, but of the moment when still a basically bourgeois Republican revolution would still be a transformative thing. Castelar rides US support, including military, into becoming president. He patterns himself after Lincoln and Mexico President Benito Juarez in making alliance with the military and using martial law. And he tries to convince fellow Republicans that they can ride out a period. He makes explicit comparisons to the US. He says it takes the US 10 years to resolve the Civil War, and that he needs a period of martial law to do the same thing to Spain what Lincoln and the Republicans did in the United States or Juarez in Mexico. He eventually loses a vote for those powers in the Spanish Cortes, and his government is toppled first from within and then from without in a military coup after he's relieved. And then the Spanish Republic kind of sinks in certain ways out of sight. But for a while, he's a hugely influential figure, a frequent writer in Harper's as well as other US magazines, remains for the rest of the century a frequent writer in Spanish American publications as a defender of what his hopes are for a liberal Republican order. One that can, as he says, Spain had a historic mission to bring, in his view, Christianity and European civilization to the Americas. And that in the 19th century, as Europe turned back to monarchy, his vision was that Spain would be the site to bring the American system of republics back across the Atlantic and into Europe. He fantasizes an early version of the European Union, as well as other ways of imagining a sort of global Republican moment. That fades and fails, and in some ways it takes with it some of these revolutionary hopes for the Civil War, along with other things on an international level. And so I use that to explore the question of what impact did the Civil War, if it was launched to remake the world, what impact did it have, and how we see that in Cuba or Brazil in slavery, but also in Spain, and to a lesser degree in France and other more familiar sites, as a place where people took inspiration and radical hope in a moment that looked to them as a period of conservative monarchical triumph.
Great. So as I said, I have some other questions. Maybe if anyone has a question in the audience, you can use the raise hand function if you want to speak in the Zoom meeting, or you can just put something in the chat window, and I will look. We already have one by Sean Gallagher. So go ahead, Sean. I'll unmute you. And
hi, Professor Downs.
Hey, Sean.
One really interesting discussion throughout most of the chapters is this idea of kind of like revolutionary time, or this idea of that the Civil War is this moment of being able to kind of enact things in rapid succession that you would not be able to do in kind of other moments. And this is both a kind of rhetorical thing that Lincoln and military general use, but then in the last chapter, especially when you're talking about Spain, it's also this kind of sense of the possible. And kind of a big chronological or like a big dividing moment in your book is 1873, 1874, right? In which the Panic of 1873 in the US and then the fall of the Spanish Republic in these different ways kind of closes this moment of revolutionary possibility. But I'm wondering, what would you say about kind of enslaved people's own conception of time during this? Like, do enslaved people, or I should say ex-slaves, freed men and women, see 1873 the same way the Republican Party sees it? Do they see that this, like, do Black women and men in the South see the moment as closed at that, or do they have their own sense of revolutionary time?
Yeah, no, those are very good questions. So first I'll try and just deal with the sort of overall framework for the people who, unlike Sean, haven't read it so carefully yet. Jaimey said there's no entry quiz on the book, but as Sean accurately says, one of the things that I'm interested in is the conception of people at the time, as well as of social scientists, the one that's not always so clear in history literature, of the idea of these revolutionary situations, and that the ways to judge the transformative potential of an era less by reading a kind of avant-garde hope, and more about the ways that situations transform people's sense of the possible, a kind of sequential transformation of common sense. And that's one of the things I think that makes the US Civil War so confusing, because some of the revolutionary actors look like conservatives in the 1850s, or certainly moderates. and suddenly they find themselves transformed by time. To us, if we're schooled in a sense of looking for an avant-garde, that makes them not real revolutionaries. But in fact, I think that if you look in the broader scope of revolutions, the people who move in and to act, in certain ways, are the people who we judge a revolution by. That, as I say at a certain point, that people who are self-conscious revolutionaries only infrequently make revolutions, but revolutions make revolutionaries out of people who otherwise might not be. And that's what makes a revolution, this sense of the possible. But this is a really hard thing to measure. How do we know what people think is possible? How do we judge when people think that, see their possibilities correctly? This is something that revolutionary theorists from, as Sean knows better than I do, from Marx and Lenin on, have really wrestled with. Timing. How do you picture what's possible at a certain moment? And how do you utilize that to figure out how to maximize advantage of a particular moment? And people, of course, see that timing differently. But I do argue that there's something interesting to me about what happens on the countries I'm interested in, almost in sequence in 1873 to 1875. So that we tell in the US story of retreat from Reconstruction, in which the answers for why Reconstruction ends up going backwards seem to depend upon specific to the US factors, either a loss of belief, a loss of faith, a sense that they never really saw themselves as revolutionaries in terms of Republican leaders, sort of mysterious, seemingly mysterious, though explicable in other ways, economic recession, political defeat in 1874, and alleged compromise of 1877. And yet what's interesting to me is how unsurprising the US retreat looks in this global context. It happens almost exactly at the same time as the overthrow of the First Spanish Republic. It happens as Mexico itself is going into its own series of battles over the future of the Juarez movement that'll lead to coups and the eventual establishment of a single-party dictatorship. And that in fact, the movement, as Sven Beckert and other scholars have said, the movement away from democracy is pretty widespread in the 1870s and 1880s, not just specific to the US. That doesn't mean the US causes don't matter, but it does mean that it's interesting to think about what role the Civil War had helped in playing in helping to inspire people to think things were possible. And where the much less fun topic to study, but the possibly just as important topic of pessimism comes in. Why people lose that faith and that confidence, and what that does to activists. And that raises the question of people who might see themselves as more avant-garde, especially as we look at people who are especially former slaves and other people who might have always defined themselves as beyond a kind of, center left, however we want to think of Northern Republicans in this time period. And certainly there remains a sort of politics of hope that scholars have talked about where that comes from in the face of odds turning against them. And yet I think you can also see very clearly between 1873 and 1877 in a kind of sense of a reconfiguration of possibility. You see this in some ways in the outrage and despair at times of Frederick Douglass, something that doesn't lead him to sort of give in to what's going on, but certainly a recognition of it. And we see it in other ways in a figure like Henry Adams, not the Adams of the Adams political family or the political education of, but Henry Adams, a former slave in Louisiana who had served in the US Army during the Civil War, who came back and who tried to use his Army contacts after the Civil War to create a network of Black politically engaged informants. He testifies at the end of the decade that starting around this time, he starts writing to these informants to ask them, if life is not viable here in Louisiana, where should we go? Is it that Tennessee or North Carolina or an upper South state? And he describes mass meetings where there's a large-scale debates over these questions in this period between 1873 to 1875. Are Louisiana and Mississippi lost? And is the right move to make in this crisis flight? By 1877, he argues that the answer to that is flight, but not to other southern states, but out entirely. And he's a part of, and his followers are a part of, some of the resurgence, surprising resurgence of a Liberia movement, And he becomes a leader in a related but somewhat distinct movement to move toward the West, especially to Kansas, and what we call exodusters. And he really outlines not a decline in his sense of his hope for the world, of how it should be, but his sense of the possibility of acting in a world not of their own making, even in Mississippi and Louisiana, where, as he talks about, if elections could be handled fairly, he could prevail. So I do think there are distinctions between people who lose hope and move on to other things versus those people who lose hope but look for other seemingly radical possibilities. But I do think that this turning point creates a kind of transatlantic despair by the 1870s, 1880s, and therefore when international radicalism has to be reconstructed, it has to be made in some ways out of somewhat different materials.
Okay, I think we have another question from Daniel Castaneda. I'll unmute you. Hopefully. Daniel, I don't know why I can't unmute you.
Hey, is it able to now? Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you again, Professor Downs, for speaking to us. Hey, how's it going?
Good,
I had a question as I was thinking through your book, and this might be maybe a little too specific to me, but hopefully it'll be helpful. But I was wondering, if we think about this period as a revolution, as your book encourages us to do, and especially I was struck when you, in the section where you talk about how Southern politicians would file these legal challenges, but Congress said they wouldn't observe them or accept them anyway. And so I wonder, how do you think this traumatic experience of sort of this congressional revolution and this congressional power colors American political history more broadly? Does this help lead to sort of this idea of a strong centralized presidency, or what is like the sense, I guess, in Congress of this particular period? If you had anything on that.
Yeah, no, that's a big question. It just as it's tempting for U.S. Civil War historians to say the U.S. Civil War changed the world, it's also tempting for us sometimes to say, yes, we create it's also the period that creates the 20th century state. And there are some reasons to be interested in that, and certainly the war itself leads to an expansion. And yet, in other respects, I think that I'm more persuaded by people like Gary Gerstle and others who emphasize how much of the 20th century state has to be made anew, some from work that comes out of the 1880s and 1890s, but of how little of the US Civil War state government actually survives into the early 20th century, and that it has to be radically reconfigured. So that raises the question of where did it go? One way of answering the question of why the Second American Revolution didn't create as big an impact as we might like or hope, or for late 20th century historians writing backwards, why it didn't last the way that they believed, perhaps now over optimistically that the New Deal civil rights order would last in perpetuity, was that it wasn't a revolution at all, and that it didn't really try to change things. I do try and peel at that and to look at what it means to think about the boldness of what was done. And yet we do have to wrestle with the questions you raised about how much of it was peeled back over the latter parts of the 19th century, while also keeping hold of how much did abide, that what did survive included a series of not just amendments, but including a series of protections, totally not up to the level of what people hoped for during the Civil War and Reconstruction, or certainly not what we would look forward to, but something fundamentally different than what existed in the 1850s in terms of the US order. So that poses a series of questions, right? One, why did Southern politicians, believe they had the power to do so? What does that tell us about the relationship of the between state and local power and the federal government? And those have been the source of massive, large and important and massive works on the violent nature of the overthrow of the Reconstruction order in Southern states, the use of coups and of other, and of other paramilitary politics. And also the growing, to my mind, not intact until the 1890s sense on the Northern populace of a kind of fatalism, that no matter what, white Southern politicians would turn to violence to undo what was done in the South instead of acceding to it. And this kind of fatalism built in as a younger generation moves into political power in the 1890s and early 1900s. So those are the things that I think do lead to this peeling back. But it's also true, as you suggest, that a number of Southern politicians for decades reject the idea of Reconstruction as legitimate and try and argue, and in certain ways this persists in American life, that it's an illegitimate, it's taught that way, as a mistake, as an error, as a period of corruption, and as something that's not part of the legitimate, of a legitimate second founding in Eric Foner's vision. And we see this in the idea of the amnesia around the creators of Reconstruction, people like Frederick Douglass or Thaddeus Stevens, or you know, a whole slew of people who play important roles in it. But they're not the people, even though they're crucial to the three most important, in my view, amendments that are passed in US constitutional history. They're not people that we look back to generally as founders of the country that we live on. And that does reflect the sense that the compromise that emerges as a cultural separation from Reconstruction, you know, that grows over the late 19th and early 20th century. And that means that in certain ways, the radical potential that's built into some of the 20th century things that you're talking about has to be built anew with fresh tools.
Great, and we have a question actually in the chat room from Nicholas Garcia. If the Civil War had an impact on Republican movements in Europe, did the 1848 Republican movements in Europe have an effect on the Civil War? I'm curious because looking from the perspective of Italy, it's clear that Republican leaders like Mazzini and Garibaldi were eagerly looking to the US during the Civil War to follow through on some of the promises of 1848.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a really big question. There's a number of scholars who have looked at it. And certainly scholars have been interested in this confluence that the US political crisis of the late 1840s does overlap significantly with a series of revolutions that spread across Europe. Some of them kind of liberal nationalist revolutions, others producing a kind of more radical, you know, socialist fronts. And the question of that influence. At one level, the influence is harder to trace than we might find. Many Americans did not look back to the 1848 revolutions as paradigms, some because the Americans were more conservative, but others, I argue, because they're radical in a different way, which is they're looking for victory. And so the idea of a series of mostly failed revolutions didn't appeal to the people who are looking to try and create fundamental, permanent, lasting change in the ways that some other revolutionary moments did produce a kind of sense of analogies that people look for. So that it was discredited by some Americans for being too radical, but for others for not working, in that sense for not being successful. And yet there are ways that we can trace its influence. One of which is actually in a group that looks mostly pretty conservative. Northern and a few Southern leaders of a group called Young America, who look to the revolutions in Europe as this moment of a revolutionary romantic nationalism that they think will renew American promise if they can capture a boldness and break the complacency of American life. Most of these people are Democrats. Most of them end up in alliance with Southern slave owners, and they are in the 1840s and 1850s impatient with Northern anti-slavery politics for blocking what they see as the nation's future. How to restore greatness to the country? Become an empire. And become an empire by harnessing a revolutionary fervor to expand. So yes, take Cuba and also take Canada and take everywhere. And they get impatient in the 1850s with Northern anti-slavery for seeming to block it. Yet, as I argue, so in this sense, they seem a very unpromising form of connection, people who look to us like slaveholder allies. Yet in a way that reminds us of the limited power of slaveholders over the 1850s and of the radical and growing power of Northern Republicans, many of these people, like their Cuban exile allies, end up actually coming over the late 1850s to believe that the only source for expansionary greatness and revolutionary fervor in the US is anti-slavery. And so while many of them don't care about slavery as a moral issue, quite a number of them become backers of the Civil War, whether financially, August Belmont, militarily, Daniel Sickles, who later becomes the key minister to Spain. And this interesting way in which they aim to capture a kind of combination of revolution with expansion of slavery. But over time, many of them in 1860 to 61, forced to choose between revolution and slavery, pick an anti-slavery revolution. So that's an odd and interesting. They're out and they're very frustrated with the Democratic Party for not backing revolutionary movements in Europe and aim to overthrow that. Another is through exiles. And so there's a number of German exiles that scholars have been very interested in. Andrew Zimmerman, who's originally a German historian, is now writing a book on the movement of Red Republicanism, of exiled German socialists, not so much Karl Schurz, but of Siegel and other more socialist inclined Germans into the United States, and of the ways that they create an active radical edge, first in US politics and then in the US Army, where they're very active in the Civil War, especially early on in Missouri, and in radicalizing the Civil War. So there certainly are these interesting engagements. And yet part of my suggestive argument in this piece, in the book, is that we actually get more from the transformation of Cuba in the late 1840s, 1850s, than in the, to my view, sort of easy to overstate the impact of 1848 revolution in the US.
Great. We have one more question in the chat room, and I think if there's then a perhaps final question after that, I think we'll close out the session and hopefully ask Greg about his next project. But this one in the chat room does relate to something that I think, Greg, comes up in the book but hasn't been discussed yet. The question is from Steve: is it possible to see an impact of the Second American Revolution in the constitution of new states that were created and incorporated into the US after 1870?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's two ways of, there's one very direct way, which is that if we mean by, depending on how we mean constitution. So the very direct way is the creation of new states. One of the things that's fascinating, we tend to write about mid-19th century Republicans, is how bold they were about creating new states. And we tend to write about them because we're heightened awareness of what didn't happen, as if they're moderates. But as I say, in the book, Benjamin Harrison would be far more radical figure than Bernie Sanders on constitutional order in the current climate. He's, seems like a classic milquetoast moderate, but when he comes in as president, he's like, the Democrats are starting to expand their power. Let's make as many new states as we can in a hurry and fix the Senate in order to stack the deck in our favor for years. Meanwhile, radical politicians in a current moment defend the filibuster and movements that, would seem unimaginably conservative, even in an 1880s context. That they were really, the mid-19th century Republicans, of which Harrison's kind of one of the trailing edge of, had a heightened awareness that to change the country, you change the structure. And we have, I think, as befits a sort of more technocratic age, a sense that you change the country by changing its policies, or maybe hoping for a better Supreme Court. In the 1860s, the Republicans didn't hope for a better Supreme Court. They just expanded the court. And then when they didn't want who Andrew Johnson was going to appoint, they shrunk it. And they created new seats in Republican leading areas. And then when the Supreme Court threatened to get in their way, they threatened to abolish it. In that sense, they're much bolder structurally than anybody in the American spectrum of politics today. And this included making new states, that if you're in trouble in Congress because of the growth of slave states, you made more northern states. They do this, during the Civil War. Kansas, arguably comes in still as a number of Southern representatives are in place, but is brought in as a free state. West Virginia is created in total abeyance of normal constitutional provisions, hiving it off of Virginia, making it an anti-slavery state. Nevada. Then, as there's a goal during 1864 to also, or late 1863 to 64, to also create states in Colorado and Nebraska in order to fix the Electoral College. When that doesn't work, but eventually Nebraska is brought in shortly thereafter. Why are they bringing more states in? They want to pass a constitutional amendment, and they need to get up to 2/3, and so they create states in order to get up to 2/3. They're pretty explicit about it. And so in this sense, it captures a basic sense that they had, that if the constitutional system isn't working, you fixed it. And I'm concerned that on the sort of left, not just the center left, but even the left, there's a tendency, as befits a legalistic age to, the constitutional system doesn't work, to call for the refs. But there are, I think as we see that we can't have that faith that the refs are going to step in and save the day, especially if we're looking at a Supreme Court. And it might well be time to regain their sense of the bold way to fix the Constitution is to change the constitutional order. To this extent, it's impressive to me to think about how unimaginable this was in 2009 when Democrats had 60 seats in the Senate and didn't bring in Washington, D.C. as a state. It was barely even discussed. Puerto Rico might be a separate issue because it turns a great deal upon how we're going to judge whether Puerto Ricans want to enter as a state or not, which is a crucial issue. But DC, where there had been a movement for statehood, the Democrats with control of all three branches don't even bring it up. And this, I think, suggests a way in which, as a group, not just individual personalities, the left has really lost its sense that the goal of isolating problems is to explain how they can be fixed. And rather than saying the Senate is fixed against them, the answer is to explain how to fix the Senate. And I agree that the timing doesn't seem especially propitious, but I think that the costs of falling into seeming to point to problems that are irresolvable, that the costs of that are even worse. More narrowly, and this might be what the question was actually about before I detoured it to one of my hobby horses, is as has been written about, especially by political scientists, state constitutions, which are fascinating, but relatively unstudied, in the late 19th century get remade in fascinating ways, including the creation of all kinds of positive rights. We have a lot of discussion, including a prominent Atlantic piece on the difference between negative and positive freedoms, freedom to and freedom from. And this is maybe true in a US constitutional framework, but in a state constitutional framework, in fact, those divisions fade very quickly. Many 19th century constitutions include positive rights to education, not all of which are enforced, as well as other forms of positive rights. And it's clear that this does come out of an overall radicalization of the idea of government, even if it's not always expressed at the federal level. I wouldn't say that Reconstruction in some ways is an effect of that as much as it's a cause of it. I don't think that Reconstruction causes all of those transformations, but it is fascinating to watch how many states remake their constitutional orders in the period of and around Reconstruction, including California, in all kinds of ways that express a boldness. Though, as we know, some of the remaking of California's Constitution in 1879 is a boldness of a claim of white supremacy, of eliminating provisions of the older Constitution for Spanish language use and governance, as well as other provisions, though an expansive vision of suffrage for white men. So there is clearly this effort that seeps through state governance, and also a sense that the bold moves that go on after the failures at the federal government in the late 1870s are really happening at the state government. This also, I think, is a chastening reminder for today, where it has been more recently evident of a focus by left and center-left activists upon transforming state houses, winning state houses in time to affect the 2020 census and the reallocation of legislative seats, and creating bolder models of state governance, and not looking to the federal government as the key driver of transformative change. So we see steps moving in that direction, but it is also true the 19th century reminds us of how much emphasis that activists put on transforming states in that time period.
Great, well, thanks, Greg. We're just at about 7, so I was wondering, maybe I'll exercise my privilege as the moderator to ask you a final question about your future projects, because this one's so interesting and fascinating. I wonder if this opened up any other avenues, doors, interests for you, or if you could just talk about what you're planning to do next, what you're working on now.
Yeah, so I've been, playing around with some different ideas, but the thing that I'm working on most directly right now is actually not really my project, but my friend Tony Kay had asked me, as he was, struggling with health ailments, had asked me to, take up his work on recasting Nat Turner in a world who leads a slave uprising in 1830s Virginia. Recasting him in a world of transformed 19th century religion and of evangelical prophecy and militance in an early 19th century religion. So Tony died with the book Undone almost exactly 3 years ago, this week. And I've been working on other things on it, and then moved more directly into that. and of trying to ask some questions about what it means to see things like early 19th century Virginia, questions that Tony was asking, I'm trying to follow through on, as a place where lots of people are actually walking around claiming to be prophets. And also as a place where evangelical religion is charged with the militants after the American Revolution. And so to see Nat Turner, in some ways it's counter to some of the interest I have in my book, but Tony was interested in seeing Nat Turner not as a forerunner or a part of an age of revolutions, but Nat Turner as a person deeply invested in a different sense of transformative time, which is what it means to live in biblical time. And therefore, some of the mysteries to us around Nat Turner of the commitment to killing every person they found as being explained in Turner's own reading of Joshua and other books of the Bible, and of Nat Turner's march toward the county seat of Southampton, which at the time was called Jerusalem, as a way of restoring a godly kingdom on earth, of making them seem stranger and less familiar rather than a sort of herald of Frederick Douglass or later 19th century enslaved rebels. So it's been an interesting way to kind of move outside of some of my own assumptions and presuppositions, and also to try and write through someone else's obsessions and voice. And also a good way of doing something you and I have talked about, which is the difficulty over time of pausing between projects and reassessing what one should do, of not kind of writing from one to the next in a way that each one organically grows out of, which can be fun, but of also stepping back and to say that with this incredible privilege and luxury of intellectual life that we have, to ask what are the things that are most compelling to me, and what are things that I've sort of left to the side in this focus, especially upon the post-Civil War moment. So Jaimey, Jaimey, to me, you are frozen in deep contemplation, which I'll take as a sign.
Jaimey froze, and I may need to take over. I'm the associate director, Kathy Wallerstein.
Hi, Kathy.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of y'all for signing in.
Excuse me?
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for signing in.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And yep, I think Jaimey is gone. All right. Have a great night. And yeah, like Jaimey said, this will be up on our YouTube channel. So if you know of anybody who did not get a chance to watch, please direct them to the channel. Which you can find.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay.
Have a nice night and be well.
You as well. Bye-bye.